All right, so I've already made a couple of videos like this, but I found myself in my life rethinking a lot of old films, and whether the protagonists that were portrayed are actually right, and whether the bad guys are actually bad. And the movie Gladiator has just been nagging at me, so I'm gonna make a video about this. I just want to say beforehand, like, this isn't a critique of the film Gladiator as a film at all. It's one of the best films I've seen in my life. It's epic. It's awesome. It's just everything, right? So like, this isn't a criticism of the movie. The movie's incredible. You shouldn't watch this video and then like watch the movie differently. But I just think that the good guys and the bad guys, like I don't actually agree with the portrayal of that after giving it a lot more thought. So let's go into this. I think the first thing that we could all kind of agree on is that even if you agree with Marcus Aurelius in the film, like he was a piece of shit, right? By the way, there's no evidence that Marcus Aurelius actually ever wanted Rome to become a senate again after his death. So this was completely made up by the writers, right? But like, if you think about it, like, okay, so he's this person who has this deep seated conviction that Rome should actually be a senate, and he's gonna wish this on his deathbed. He's not gonna like put this into action right during his life to make sure that it goes well. Where he's not going to like abdicate as emperor. He's going to make it like a wish after his death that he's going to whisper into his general's ear, right? Like this is ridiculous, right? And like it's especially ridiculous, like knowing the story of Rome, right, of the time, right, that like he's just going to like go to Germania and whisper this to his general's ear, and then tell his son this and expect not to get murdered, right? Like, this is Rome we're talking about, and I'm going to get into this in a moment. So, I mean, I'm not saying that Marcus Aurelius, the actual historical figure, was a piece of shit. I'm just saying that like the way that Marcus Aurelius, the character, acted in this film, knowing what we know about Rome, was like a pretty shitty way to act, right? Like, you should have done this decades earlier. You should have started putting together a process to get Rome to become a republic. And by the way, if Rome is so much better as a republic than it is as a empire, then like you should have done this immediately when you became emperor, right? Like, why is it that everyone else should be living under a republic, but like you should be the one to still have the chance to be the emperor, right? Like, you should do this. Like there's this whole like virtuous thing, like, I'm gonna do it after my death. It's like, no, do it when you're alive. Like, do the good stuff when you're alive that like hurts you, right? Because again, like, he would be like slightly hurt by not being emperor, right? He would still be extravagantly rich, right? But like, he just didn't really care about these convictions enough. Again, like, I'm saying this in like a historical context, like in the context of this film, not a historical context, because like there's no evidence that Marcus Aurelius actually wanted this to be the case. And there's actually good reason for this. Is that like, I think that there's this valorization of the time that like Rome was a republic that is completely ahistorical, and like that is completely based upon the fact that like America is a republic. So we look back on like the Roman Republic and we're like, oh, Rome was so much better as a republic than it was as an empire. And like, if you actually like look at the history of it, like, this is one, it's tenuous as at best, right? Like you can make the argument, and if you're making the argument, it's a tenuous, bad argument to make. And I would go so far as to say it's just completely false, right? Like, I'm not like it's anywhere in terms of incorrectness from just slightly wrong to the stupidest argument I've ever heard. And like, again, this is propped up by people who have never read a history of Rome that started from before 52 BC. Right? Like, they just say, oh, it was a republic, it had a senate, this was their structure, and Julius Caesar overthrew it. Not really, he was just a dictator for a time, but that's a different story. And Augustus was really the one who overthrew it, and turned it into an empire. Like, Caesar was still working within the constitutional norms of a dictatorship, while like Augustus was the one who was like, no, we're changing this into an empire. But anyway, that's a different story. The point is that before Augustus did that, like Rome was incredibly uh, volatile, right? So, and I'm gonna get into this in a second, but so Rome didn't have like a set out constitution, really. It just kind of had like an informal constitution, and one of the problems with that is that the Roman people in general had a culture that was incredibly uh, that really valued victory over being a good person. And so what you had this constant state of different groups within the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, fighting over each other in order to be in charge, right? And so the best way that I can think about that that I can kind of explain this, I guess, is that like when the American Constitution was written, the idea was that like that like the people of the legislative branch uh would have like loyalty to the idea of Congress, right, and would check the president. And like what has happened since is that like though that's not the case, is that like there's Republicans in Congress and the Republican Senate, and like they have their allies, or a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president and their allies, right? The complete inverse is what happened in Rome, right? Is that like every single, and I think this is why they structured this way, the U.S. Constitution, is that every single group within ancient Rome was constantly fighting over each other in order to in order to be in charge, right? And one of the best examples of this, I mean, not best, it was a pretty shitty time, was these guys, Marius and Sulla. I could do a whole history about it, but basically, like, they both became dictators of Rome. They had these purges. Like literally, you had people just Sulla just like nailed lists of names on like walls, and like they just like were like slaughtering people wholesale throughout the city of Rome. And like you had one person who was in charge one day, and like everyone was swearing allegiance to him, and then like the next day another person was in charge, and then like everyone who swore allegiance to that first person was like killed. Right, like it was a really brutal, unstable, terrible time because they didn't have this constitution. They didn't have this set out power. And one thing, again, just because I love Caesar, people people talk about Caesar, so the historically correct statement about Caesar is that he was the first person to march an army on Rome from the north, right? And a lot of people take that to believe that Caesar was the first person to march an army on Rome, and that's not true. Sulla was the first person to march an army on Rome, and this was decades before Caesar, right? It's just that it's just that Sulla did it from the south, and there was like a thing about that, right? But like Caesar did it from the north, but like he wasn't the first dictator of Rome. Sulla and Marius were, and these were these guys called the Gracchi. I don't really feel like getting to them, but that was like another time of like major political instability, right? So, the and so this is like one thing that like I kind of like really changed my opinion about this, right? Um, and this is kind of a separate topic, but like there's this idea of like rule of the just, and then there's this idea of like rule of the strong, right? And what I kind of mean by this is that like you view you view Maximus as the good guy in this movie fundamentally because like he had like the right to this thing and it was taken away from him, right? He had the right of the guy who was going to transition this into a senate, and Commodus did this nefarious thing that like you know put him in charge, right? Like unjustly, right? But then there's the idea of like rule of the strong, which is, whoever can take the throne is the one who deserves it. And I actually, like, I mean, I think we have this thing as a society where we like generally believe in rule of the just, right? Like the person who deserves it should be the one who gets it, right? But I actually the past few years, the past 4, 5, 10 years, have been gravitating more towards Commodus' point of view, and this is actually going to be ancient Rome's point of view as well. I'm going to get into this in a moment, of rule versus the strong, which is that like the person, if you think of what's fundamentally in the best interests of the society, right? Like you don't want somebody like Maximus in charge, right? You want somebody like Commodus in charge, right? Because like Maximus is like, I mean, yeah, he's a brilliant general, all this other stuff, right? But like fundamentally, his decision making process, he's the type of person to sit on his hands, dilly dally about, not come to a strong, clear, decisive decision, right? While Commodus is the type of person to like actually go do something, right? And you can say like, oh yeah, okay, you just go and do something, you murder this person's family. I'm gonna get into that also, but like, yeah, I mean, that's the point, right? Like the actual thing. So I would argue that like the way that Rome chose these people actually chose for the best rulers, because they chose for the people who were the most decisive, the most bloodthirsty, yes, right, but the most capable people who would win the fights, right? And so, you want this system where people fight against each other, and the person who wins is by definition the best person. This is why I actually like strongly believe in U.S. Elections as like a good way to decide the best person, right? Because it's kind of like a game where you have two people competing to see who can win, and it's like whoever can win is the best person to be in charge of the country, right? And this actually, I actually think I have probably the most unpopular 2000 election take, which is that I think that George Bush stole the election, but because he stole the election, I actually believe that that makes him the better president, right? And I think that like by virtue of the fact that he stole the election, I think he deserved to be president because of that, right? Because granted, this ended up not being the case, but I think 99 times out of 100, we just got the one time out of 100 where it wasn't the case. Having the person who would do things like the Brooks Brothers riot, who would have all these machinations in court in order to get him to win the election, 99 times out of 100, that person would end up being the better president, because that is how they would operate on the world stage as well, while representing the interests of America. You don't want somebody like Al Gore being president, right? Because he's the type of person who will just be like, well, the international body proclaimed this, and it might hurt America, but that's just what it is, right? And like you don't want this person to be in charge of your country, because the same way that he sells himself out, he's going to sell out the country as large, right? And I actually think about this a lot when it comes to like someone gave me this explanation as to like why girls like bad boys, and this actually makes sense. I think justifies it from an evolutionary biology standpoint, where like the person told me the reason why girls like bad boys is because they're like, the guy who's like a nice guy prioritizes other people over himself, the girl or other people, right? But from an evolutionary biology perspective, like she's looking at that person and she's like, okay, you're prioritizing these other people over yourself in this situation. What happens when I latch myself onto you, right? And you are in charge of providing for this family. Are you going to then also prioritize other people over yourself? Because that means that that's going to hurt my child, right? And that completely changed my perspective on it. It was like, wow, this is actually like a really justified thing to like bad boys, because you're completely right? From an evolutionary perspective, you're like, wait, you're allowing other people to cut in front of you in line when you're single, when you're just looking after yourself. What happens when we have a family together? Are you going to let people cut in line then? Like, that's going to hurt my child, right? And that's a similar way in which I'm talking about like viewing choosing leaders, right? And like I think that like an important question as well is like how would the Romans have seen this, right? Like imagine if like I mean like it's a historical, right? But like imagine if uh, we had taken the first half an hour of Gladiator, right, and like went back in time to the time period, right? Like or like entered the movie, right, and like had this video evidence and showed it to the people in the Coliseum, right? Of like this is what happened. This is how Commodus took power. Like, would they have approved of this? Would they have approved of Commodus, or would they have approved of Maximus? And I think we all kind of think they would have approved of Maximus, but that's actually not true. Like, so I learned this when I was reading like a book on the history of Rome, and it really changed my opinion about Rome in general, and also like um, the role of language in shaping the way that we think. But that's another conversation. But like the Roman word for virtue is virtus, which also carries connotations of valor, masculinity, and excellence, often associated with military strength and victory. Right. So in Latin, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, people who actually know Latin, but like the word for virtue and victory are the same word, right? So the word for good person and person who wins is the same word, right? So they don't see a difference between moral goodness and winning. To them, that's the same thing, right? And so from the ancient Roman perspective, I think that if you had shown the people in the Colosseum a video of what had happened, I think they would have been like, awesome, yeah, yeah, no, Commodus, that's our guy. Look how bloodthirsty he was in becoming emperor. That's the type of guy that we want to be our emperor. Like that's the reaction I think you would have actually gotten from the ancient Romans, um, had they seen these events, right? And you also see that historically, where like if you read the history, and this is actually kind of the problem with the empire, was that the Romans were a little bit too bloodthirsty. So what happened a lot of times was like all these people would be constantly killing each other in order to become emperor, and then like from time to time, because of that, all of the good people would be dead, and then like an idiot would take over. That's what actually happened with Claudius. So like you had Augustus, Tiberius. Well, I can't believe I forgot who was after Tiberius. He's like a really famous person. Um, uh, Caligula. So you had Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and then right after Caligula was Claudius, who was a whose stammering was like a real big pussy. Like his wife was in a competition with the biggest prostitute in Rome to see who could take more men in a single day. Like Claudius's wife was the original Lily Phillips, right? Like legitimately, and so the reason for that, though, is because all of Claudius's brothers and all of the brothers of Caligula and everybody else in the Roman line who could have been a good person to take over had been murdered in the night and had like mysteriously dead in order to for somebody else to be in charge, right? And so that is the downside of that, obviously, right? But like the Romans, but because that was the culture at the time, it's very clear that the Romans would have seen Commodus as the good guy, right? Now, this obviously, like, goes to, you know, uh, Maximus's wife and son, right? It's a very graphic scene in the movie, and I think they made this scene in the movie specifically so that like it was like, okay, you're 100% on Maximus's side. But like, I don't think that the Romans would have hated Maximus. I think they would have just been like, yeah, no, I mean, we don't hate Commodus either. They would have just like been watching, just be like, who's gonna win, and we're gonna support that guy. But like Maximus's family, like they made this very graphic scene in order for you to have a lot of sympathy for Maximus. And like obviously like I think killing women and children is a bad thing, like I don't think it needs to be said, but just in case people think it needs to be said, I think it's a bad thing, right? However, you also need to like view the cultural context in which this happened, where like of course Commodus is going to kill his wife and kid, right? Like, of course, right? Because you don't want these people coming after you later in order to take the throne for you. And you'd be like, oh, what are you talking about? Like, this is like a 5-year-old child. Well, a 5-year-old child turns into an 18-year-old man, and an 18-year-old man is the type of person who can murder you. The best example of this, actually, I alluded to him earlier, was Augustus. So Augustus, right over here, was originally Octavian Caesar, who, after his uncle Julius Caesar was murdered by um, by Brutus and Cassius, he went, raised an army. I forgot how old he was at the time. Like the specific age. Let's get this up. So Augustus Caesar was born 63 BC. Julius Caesar was murdered 44 BC. So he was 19 at the time, right? Very young. He literally went out, raised an army, allied with with Mark Antony, who was Caesar's right hand man, and then literally went and like murdered these two people and took back his empire. Right. So this is something that like is fresh on the minds of everybody at the time. It's literally the founding of the empire, right? So like when you kill somebody, you don't just kill them. Like we think in terms of like modern American, times where like, you know, like George Bush's kids don't have any more legitimate claim to be president because their father was president than anybody else in America. That's not true in ancient Rome. Your credibility to the throne is determined by your lineage, right? So the way to make sure that nobody can take over the throne from you is by murdering everybody who has a credible claim to the throne due to their lineage, right? Different time, right? And so that's what Brutus didn't do in 52 BC, 44 BC, and so like every other person from then on was like, I learned my lesson. I'm not going to allow this to happen to me, and that's how you kill the family. It just sucks, right? And then like one final thing about Commodus is that like, it's like at the end of the day, like what do you expect Commodus to do? Like fundamentally, like what do we expect Commodus to do? Do you expect him to just let this birthright of his go away and not become emperor? Right? Like, no, he's gonna fight for that. And then like once he's decided to fight for that, like what? Like you're just gonna allow this like general to come and like do this stuff? No, obviously. Are you gonna just allow your sister to like have like try to overthrow you? Like of course not. You're gonna like do what needs to be done to stay in power. So like at the very least, if you weren't convinced by me that Commodus was right, which just from a moral perspective, again, the Roman Empire was far more stable and far better than the Roman Senate. So that's just like a utilitarian perspective, right? Like Rome was better as an empire, right? A, B, having the strong rule over the just is better in my opinion. But hopefully I convinced you of that. And then C, like even if I didn't convince you of that in today's times, at least you can see how people back then viewed that. Like literally, it's the same word, virtue and victory. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram.